All right. We're all here, all the experts, except for me, in one room. But hello, everyone. I'm Christine with Startup TNT, and we wanted to record some of the high-level questions and themes that come up when you're either an investor that's new to investing in life science, or perhaps you're a life sci company that's new to raising. But we found over the years that there's common questions that are very specific and unique to this sector. So as referenced, joining me today, I have three experts in the room, and I will pass it off to Launa to introduce herself.
Thanks, Christine. Thanks for having me here. My name is Launa Aspelet, and I am a pharmaceutical scientist by training, and also have my regulatory affairs certification. And I've been fortunate enough to work in the biotech industry my entire career right here in Edmonton. I've been with two biotech startups that had their offices here in Edmonton, and have seen drug development from the discovery phase right through to the marketing authorization. So I think I've been really lucky. I've also spent a number of years as the CEO of a CRO, so running clinical trials for drug companies, both small startup companies and large pharma companies. So I've seen that angle of things as well. So at the moment, I am the board chair of API here in Edmonton, also a board member of Edmonton Unlimited, and I advise for a number of different biotech companies within North America. So,
awesome.
Thank
you. And Christian?
Good. Well, my name is Christian Idicula, and I work in a biotech right now, primarily on operations, but my background prior to this was in venture building and investment, and worked with a number of companies in life sciences and digital health in the startup phase, going through preclinical. So a lot of my experience has been in that side, which is usually getting off the ground and getting towards the clinic, which is exactly where I am right now with the biotech. So happy to be here, talk a bit about some of the experiences in that, and share whatever insights I can.
All right. And Colin?
Yeah, thanks, Christine, for having me. So my name's Colin Coros. I'm the Chief Commercialization Officer for a company called Nanostics. As far as background goes, I have a PhD in biochemistry and an MBA degree in biotechnology. Currently with a biotech company, as I said, Nanostics, where we've developed a prostate cancer diagnostic test, which we spun out of the university and is now on the market in Canada, United States. And have also participated as an investor for TNT. So kind of bring both sides to the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And yeah, thanks all you experts for coming to talk about some of these key themes at a very high level. We want to keep it accessible. And I know myself, sometimes as a scientist, I can dig a little bit deeper, but we're going to try and keep this at a level that everyone can understand. So moving first to Launa, I think the overarching thing was, what are the key questions that we want to ask a venture before you invest? And as you have a therapeutics background, maybe we could start there. But well, whether it's therapeutics, med device, or even wellness, what are these key questions that you want to ask them? How do you break it down?
Sure. I think we can look at regardless of the technology, I think we can look at sort of three main buckets. I think you want to take a look at the team that the company has put together and their backgrounds, their experience, and not only the internal team, but who they have as advisors or perhaps board members or consultants. And then the second bucket would be the technology itself. So you want to take a look at the technology, the research that's been done to date to show that this serves its purpose, and also its intellectual property. Have they protected that? What does that look like? What is the patent life? And then the third bucket would be the market. So what is the market that they're after? What is the competition in that market? what other companies may be developing something in that market, and what does that look like for their long-term goals. So those are sort of the three big buckets, but of course there's lots of detail within each.
Yeah, absolutely. But the other part that comes up that as a new investor, I'm curious what you think the red flags might be.
Well, there could be many depending on the product, but I think some red flags might be if they haven't looked at their development plan and their regulatory strategy, because this is very dependent on the technology that they're developing. And do they have that laid out? Do they know what their ultimate plan is? How much money it's going to take along the way, just not in the short term, but in the long term? And then do they have milestones associated with that so that they know when they've reached a particular milestone that may show that they have de-risked their product and gotten to a stage where they can maybe interest partners or larger investors, or what does that look like? So they should have that sort of from start to finish. Another red flag may be that things like patents, that they haven't even thought about their patents yet. That's really crucial in this industry, that they have protection over their technology. And what does that look like? So those are just a couple things I would say. I'm sure there's many others that the rest of the group could add as well.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll get into them as we dig a bit deeper into these different buckets and areas. But yeah, I think maybe let's shift over to Christian now. And like Christian, you're in the preclinical space right now. But I was hoping, could you give us just a quick once over of what the usual pathway is for getting a drug to market?
Well, on the preclinical side, you're usually looking from the point of discovery. So when the molecule or the essential idea is discovered, you're going through a series of steps to validate that, usually with some very basic sort of bench testing, in vivo or in vitro testing. Usually you would do like the cell testing or something like that, depending on the technology, of course. And then you need to go into actual animals in order to test that. Each path is a bit unique, drawing what Launa was saying before. It depends on the technology. If it's a relatively known path, it's been done before, then usually there's sort of a standard set of things you might draw upon from what everyone else has done, because by the time you get to the regulator, they're going to be looking for certain types of data or a certain level of data that warrants them saying, yes, you're now allowed to put this into a human for a clinical trial. When you get into these scenarios where it's less known or it's very new or very cutting edge, it becomes a little bit more challenging because you are sort of feeling out in the dark exactly what kind of data you need. And I mean, in the area I'm in, we're dealing with mRNA technology and rare diseases. So we're in a very different path than a sort of well-worn with small molecules, for example. And so, in that case, we're looking to a lot of expertise outside, those who have dealt with these technologies or these indications before, and in the rare case where they've actually combined them and try to put that together. And it's a lot of fact finding to get to that point. And your plan evolves. So like Launa was saying, you want to have a development plan. And what I find is I keep revisiting that development plan because we always get new information that evolves that. And I think it's a fun part of the process to always be learning, but it always means you're also adapting constantly. And so that's just to get to the regulator, because we know the questions around them will be, what data do you have? Have you looked at the precedents before, those who've gone before you, particularly where they have a lot of information, they have a certain set of expectations. What's really interesting in our particular space is that with rare diseases, especially in the United States, there's a whole framework that's actually quite distinct for this area. So it runs parallel to what you see in sort of the normal path. The normal path would be you get to the regulator, they make sure you've got what you need, and if they approve you, Then you go through phase 1 for safety, phase 2 for a small group of around efficacy, so safety and efficacy, and then phase 3 is usually a lot bigger with a bigger cohort of people. In rare diseases, we run parallel to that, and there's a whole bunch of variations that might exist in terms of, how many people can you really get? How long do you need? What's the technology you're applying? So then it varies quite dramatically.
Yeah, interesting. And I mean, that makes sense from like how many patients can you actually get? Like the FDA is not out to like totally ding you, but they have to be realistic in their approach. But maybe I'll put it back to Launa, who spent some more time sort of on that further end, that further, commercially developed side of things. But the usual pathway, once you're at that first in human time, can you give us just an overview of sort of where you go from your first meeting with the FDA to market?
Sure. So for a traditional drug, you would do your first in human trial, and that's often that's in healthy volunteers, but sometimes if you're in something like cancer, you would be doing it in cancer patients. But so your first in human is the first time you've ever given that drug to a human. So it's a quite exciting time, also quite a nerve-wracking time, but it's a very important time. And then that's considered a phase 1 trial. And then often you'll have another phase 1 trial. So there are often more than one at each of these various phases. So you'll have a phase 1A, a phase 1B, and all of these are done just to test the safety of the drug and to test it in a setting where it will be used. So depending on the dosing schedule of your drug, these may be shorter or longer. Once you've proven that safety in that healthy volunteer population, then you can move into the phase 2 trial. The phase 2, again, as Christian mentioned as well, is looking at safety in a larger population. And this time it's in your desired patient that you want to give the drug to. And you're also starting to get signals of efficacy just to confirm that your efficacy is there. But again, the FDA, Health Canada, they really want to see the safety of the drug. So you're doing that at phase 2. And again, at phase 2, you may have more than one phase 2. You may only have one. You may have a 2A and a 2B. It all depends on the drug. And it depends on your conversations with the regulators, what that might look like and what's most appropriate for your indication. Then once you get that, you move into phase 3. Now, phase 3 are the large trials. These are where you're really going to gather all of your efficacy of your product at that time. And often the FDA or Health Canada will want to see 2 phase 3 trials. And the reason they want to see this is they want to see that you can replicate your results. So you run one very large phase 3 trial could be 500 to 5,000 patients. And then they want you to repeat that in another patient population. And one thing I should mention, all of these trials are based on statistics. So the number of patients depend on the statistics that you need to show that your drug is working. Then once you have 2 successful phase 3s, you can hopefully you have everything else brought up in the background in terms of the animal work that needed to be done, the manufacturing, all of the quality information, and you can hopefully submit to your regulators and get approval.
Right.
Christine?
Yeah.
Can I follow up? So so you mean, it's obviously a long road. So as an investor in early stage companies that are going to invest in maybe a preclinical company that has this long journey ahead of them, this could be for Lorna or Christian. What should the investor be looking for at this stage, right? What are some things that investors should consider knowing that it's going to be a therapeutic product?
I can go first on that one. I think, the drawing back to some of Lana's comments earlier in terms of the market. I mean, if you start with the market and sort of forget for a moment that this is a very heavily regulated process and there's a lot of steps to go through. I think fundamentally it starts with what is the market? Like, what is this product all about? Is it differentiated? Like, is it going to bring something to the table that is better than what's already there? And I think that's where you kind of have to start with, which is, is this better? Is this meaningfully better? because I think we all have to bear in mind that when you're trying to dislodge an existing technology from the market, particularly in the medical and healthcare space, I mean, these are things that sort of become entrenched over time. And so you have to sort of create a systemic change by providing something that actually has meaningful impact. So that's sort of one piece. But then moving back from that is, looking at the team. Is this team, or is this able to attract a team that's going to be able to carry it through? What is the competitive situation otherwise? Like, is this something where it's going to be able to break through? Is it something where it's going to get lost in the scene? So there's kind of those, I think, truly product oriented type of questions that I certainly would look at first, and then go into the technology. I mean, the challenge with going deeply into the technologies, you will want to have some expertise alongside you who can understand that technology. But I think it really starts first and foremost with the macro, and then you can deal with the micro.
Can I ask here about, like, a lot of the companies that startup TNT deals with, it's like they're much earlier stage. A lot of them are academic spinouts. Looking at you, Colin, looking at you, Christian. So what's realistic in terms of like your, I don't know, your regulatory planning, your testing, your trials, maybe even your manufacturing that you can get done in an academic setting versus when you're like, okay, we need more money, more external expertise. We need to plan outside of this small setting. That's a big question, but it's like,
a big question. And, there's actually quite a bit you could do. I mean, there's a lot, the academic path, I mean, there are academic clinical trials, right? So there is a path that can eventually lead to that. It does have some different considerations than a commercial lane, but some of the things are still the same, which is gathering data. And when you're gathering the data in a CRO lab or an academic lab, you're still gathering data. The real question isn't so much about gathering data, it's about what kind of data are you gathering and how does that lead towards your goal. If you want to get into a commercial clinical trial, you're going to have to demonstrate to the regulator all of the things like the quality of data, that it is going to give them reassurance that it is okay to put into a person, that is going to have a market to it, all those sorts of things. So you can carry it along a fair bit of the way, I think, still in that path. But you may not have necessarily the access to some of the experience and horsepower you might get in a more commercial setting. And I mean, in our case, for sure, when because there are only so many groups that have dealt with this globally, to be able to access that horsepower, that knowledge from vendors outside of us is actually very beneficial. May not get all of that from simply one path or one area.
Yeah. And Colin, what about in your experience with spinning out from the university? What was sort of what were maybe more than one example of like a tipping point where you're like, okay, we need to bring in something outside of our small network here, or smaller?
Yeah, very similar. So, I mean, in the academic setting, your goal really is discovery of new things. And that's where academics thrive. But there's a whole other set of regulatory pathways, whole other challenges to actually bring a technology to market, right? You're going to have to raise money. You're going to have a business plan. You're going to have a strategy for regulatory. You have to figure out how you're going to get paid. And so it brings in all of these other dynamics where it's critical that you have a team or a plan to kind of manage that. And it might be a really early stage company. They may not have the answers to everything right away. Then the question becomes, am I confident that this team is willing to bring in the expertise or willing to, to partner with the right group and bring on the right advisors to help them get to those particular milestones, which they'll have to get to be, fundable at a larger scale.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. I wanted to direct us a little bit more. We sort of talked about drugs and that pathway. We also see a lot of things in the medical device or diagnostic space. Alberta has quite a few of those types of companies, Western Canada. And this is for you, Colin, but from a fairly high level, what are the device classifications, whether that's a med device or a diagnostic, and how do you sort of figure out which space they fit into?
Yeah, that's a great question, and so trying not to get too much into the weeds. I'll say, so all medical devices need to get approved by a regulatory pathway somehow, and whether your regulatory agency is FDA, Health Canada, or CE Mark in Europe, they all take a risk-based approach. So the first question they ask is, well, what's the risk of this particular device? And they have a simple classification. It's a class 1, 2, or 3, where the 3 is higher risk device and the class 1 is lower. So for example, a Band-Aid would be a class 1 device. There's not going to be a lot of harm done if you don't have the Band-Aid perfect. But a diagnostic test that is going to identify whether somebody has cancer is much more risky. It's class 3 device because you may be treating someone for cancer that doesn't need it, or you may miss a cancer that of a patient, and which could lead to bad consequences. So that's the first stage, is to identify which level of risk it is, which classification, and then the next stage is the regulatory pathway. And if you look at places like the FDA, they have very specific classifications of devices. It could be a 510K, de novo, PMA. These are all acronyms that could be thrown out there.
You those acronyms, and once you're done at this point.
Yes. So there's different detailed classifications, and they're also based on risk. So there's one classification, it's called 510K. And so 510K it's kind of a lower risk classification, and it is used when you have a predicate device. So if I'm trying to develop a new diagnostic test, and it's very similar to an existing diagnostic test on the market, such, I'll use an example. So PSA testing detects prostate cancer in men. If I say I can also have a PSA test, I'm going to measure PSA as well for prostate cancer. Since PSA is already well established, all my burden is to show that my test is as good as a PSA test. I don't have to go on to show all that clinical burden.
That sounds less expensive.
And so that means that the timelines could be quicker. There's less clinical studies. It's from an investor point of view, it means that it's quicker and faster. So what happens if you don't have a predicate on the market? If it's still a relatively low test, you could be a 510K de novo, which is going to require some level of clinical burden or justification for the test, because you're not comparing it to anything else. And then there's also a PMA, or pre-market approval of a test, and that's meant for devices that are high risk, class 3, don't have a predicate, and so that means you're going to have to do more clinical studies to prove its efficacy. You're going to have a higher burden of proof, which means longer, more money and longer timelines until you can get to the market.
Although the flip side of that, de novo novel type testing versus something that's already been done, I mean, yes, it's more expensive to do de novo, but then it's more unique. And to Launa's point from earlier, as long as the IP is, correctly wrapped up, do you think that could potentially mean a higher payoff in the end? I think
absolutely. So if I was an investor, I'd want to know if it's a 510K de novo or PMA, and if it is a 510K, it might be quicker, but then I'm going to be asking questions. What's your predicate? How much better are you than that? How are you going to displace that technology? So it leads to other questions, right? Whereas if it's a PMA, then it's quite unique. There's going to be less competition, and then it's, well, how are you going to fight off that competition that may come afterwards? And how big is the clinical study you have to do to prove it, right? And are you going to have the resources? So it's not a better or worse. It's just it leads to different set of questions as an investor I would look at.
Right. And then I'm wondering, in that space, sort of what are some of the key questions as an investor that you would ask a company, like first time meeting them in that sort of regulated space or device?
Yeah, and especially thinking about early stage companies. So I mean, when you have a new technology and you're just beginning to show that it's working and you're raising your first rounds, you won't know probably whether you're 510K and over a PMA yet, right? There's a chance that you're still beyond, like it's too early. You haven't met with the FDA. You haven't had that designation yet. So then the question just becomes, they're still good questions. So you ask the company, what's your plan? What are you? And if they look at you and they have no idea, that's a red flag, right? If they say, well, we think it's this, and we're working with these expertise, or we have someone on our team that has gone through this before, now I'm feeling more confident. So it's not all about you have to know exactly what you are, but I want to have some confidence that they understand that market dynamic and the regulatory pathway, or at least I've brought people onto the team that have thought about it.
Okay. So this theme of like, well, you don't have all the answers at the beginning. You need to bring in the team. I think that sometimes this means that maybe they haven't quite figured out what the costs are going to be. So I'll put this to Colin first, but Launa, I'd like to hear your input as well. But what are some of the maybe unexpected costs or significant expected costs that have come up when they're planning product development?
Yes, well, especially for early stage companies, and thinking of, Nanostics was spun out of the university. I mean, we did excellent research. We have, fabulous scientists. But I mean, to get through to a 510K de novo through the FDA, you need a robust quality management system. You need to set that up early on, and that's going to be, a hurdle and a big cost for an organization, especially one that's, more research or academic focus. So that's going to come up. That's going to be critical, understanding that. And the other kind of hidden thing related to cost and pricing is really one of the big differences for an early stage healthcare company or healthcare technology is trying to identify who's going to actually pay for the test. And so you could have a great test, great technology, but if there's not a willingness to pay from the health system itself and a value proposition for the health system, you don't understand who's going to actually pay for it and haven't thought about pricing and payers, then a lot of technologies are great technologies that fail just because there was no mechanism for them to get paid.
Reimbursement, always a tricky.
Reimbursement.
Yeah, so you're talking about the diagnostic or test side. I imagine that applies to the therapeutic side as well, Christian and Launa. So on this reimbursement side of things, or who's going to pay, when do you start thinking about that in your planning? And who do you need to speak to at what point to get sort of the ball rolling on your eventual revenue strategy?
I can start. I mean, I think that comes a little bit later in the development process, but you do need to start thinking about it while you're running your clinical trials, because there's a lot of data that you can gather during your clinical trials to support your the validation of the costs that you're going to be requesting at the end. So a lot of simple data can be gathered starting from phase 2, but really important in phase 3. And some of this data, like quality of life data, will be very important when you get to your pricing at the end. And a lot A lot of countries really rely a lot on that, especially over in Europe, more so I think than North America, but even in North America, it's very important. So you do need to start thinking about it at phase 2 and taking a look at what is that data that's going to show that your drug is making a real impact on patients, is better than what's out there, and what are the measurements you can use to get that. Christian, maybe you have something to add.
Yeah, it's an interesting question for us, and we have to look at it now, not from the specifics of finding what the pricing is going to be. I think, no different than what Launa was talking about. That will evolve over time, but I mean, the space where we're in with rare diseases, there's not a lot of well-worn pathway on this, and trying to really pin it down can be challenging because the drugs can be quite expensive, and that is a reflection of everything from cost to development, recovery of the investment, demand, supply dynamics, all kinds of things get factored into that. But we do have to be mindful of whether or not there is a market and how big that might be. So it's rare disease and ultra rare disease can have some very different dynamics. There is space for ultra rare for sure, but it depends on what we see as the demand and the potential for that down market. So you do have to consider it, especially when you go into something that's quite expensive to develop, and you need to have some level of certainty that there will be a market. So the ones that we're looking at, we've looked at that, and we know there is a market because there's demand. In one in particular where there's no therapy, it's going to be new for everyone. Everyone in the space is going to be looking at this new for the first time, but our reference points become some of the other similar rare diseases and what is happening with the market dynamic in there. So it's not a black and white. Unfortunately, there's a lot of gray and a lot of variations of colors in this that we have to navigate, but we are thinking about it even as early as we are.
Okay, so yeah, preclinical, you're starting to think about it, but it sounds like more from a, it's like a market need or a market pull space that you can refine that number perhaps when you're in that clinical space, and it gets clearer as you move along. I just wanted to actually bring it back to something that Colin brought up, which was QMS. It was not on the reimbursement side, but just maybe an unexpected cost or something you're like, oh, you need that. So can you tell us a little bit more about your quality management system, Colin, and sort of when was it that you needed to implement it in your development pathway?
Yeah, so from a QMS perspective, you don't need that system in place, at least for diagnostics and devices, until you're ready to define your product. So when you're at the R&D stage, you want to do good laboratory practices. You want to make sure you're doing everything right. But as soon as you define a product, this is what the product is going to be. You need to have a QMS system implemented because it has to go under scrutiny through design and development. Through you have to set out a path and targets for what you expect that technology is going to meet from a diagnostics point of view, and so it really does begin prior to hitting the market, and it's critical. You can't engage the FDA. You can't begin selling tests until every process in your whole organization is under a QMS system, and that's not just within the lab, it's within the management system itself has to be in place. Are you qualifying all the vendors for all the inputs of your test, or do you have contracts with everybody? Is like it's quite extensive. So you really want to start as early as you can, or you're just playing catch up, and it's a lot of work.
So investors should be like, maybe a company doesn't need a QMS right up front, but they should be thinking about it. Is that fair to say?
If they're talking about a product and they're talking about a strategy and asking for money, part of the money they're asking for, even an early stage company, should be going towards implementing a QMS and building that right away, for sure.
Okay, and one other sort of topic or area that I wanted to dig into a little bit is, I guess maybe this is related to QMS, a bit related to reimbursement, but there's a number of companies that maybe are early enough, they haven't quite defined if they're in that medical device space or if they're more so in the wellness area. And Launa, I mean, at API, I know you folks see quite a bit of this. You're not in that day to day, but I was curious from your perspective, what would you say is maybe the tripwire that a device that is wellness actually moves into the space where it is a true medical device that might need a higher level of regulatory input or a QMS or a better plan for how they're going to do their testing?
Yeah, I think one of the things, I think a lot of people like to think they can be in the wellness space because there's less regulations and it might be easier to get that product to market. But I think if you have a device that you're going to use to produce a result that gives a clinical diagnosis or indicates some sort of treatment is necessary or anything along those lines that suggests that there needs to be an intervention of some sort, that becomes a medical device. And so it's really important to really take a close look. And as Colin's mentioned, not all medical device regulatory pathways are really that complicated or expensive, depending on what area you're going into. So I think people shouldn't be afraid to think of their product as a medical device if really that's what it's going to do, because I think it also means a larger market in the end. But it does come down to, are you making a diagnosis? Are you giving a result that indicates a treatment is necessary or something like that? That really pushes it into the medical device arena.
Yeah, and I know we see a lot of SaaS, we see a lot of software companies that are in this space. I know TNT's evaluated a number of those. So can, I don't know, any of you, can you think of a specific time when there, maybe was a tripwire where a wellness type device moved from wellness right into maybe a class 2 software as a medical device?
One instance I was working on where there was a pretty significant debate about, is this supplementary and not necessary versus do we want to push it as something that's very much part of the overall therapy, and it really was a question of is this something that's actually should go alongside therapy, traditional therapy as a support, at which point then we would want to seriously consider the regulatory path, versus is this something that is a nice addition and can benefit but isn't necessarily being paired up with that. And that was sort of the line that we were looking at in that instance. The other question that came alongside with that was a commercialization question, which is, we've only got so many dollars, we've only got so many resources, which path can we realistically go first? It didn't preclude necessarily going the other path, right, either way. But it was really, it became a business question at a certain point, which was, we could go either way. We have to stay within the lane, but what makes sense for us to do, what's realistic, what are investors going to be interested in? Because that was also very much a critical part of the puzzle with actually getting towards the end.
From the investor standpoint, it's like I hear like, oh, we're not a regulated product, we're just in the wellness space, so it's less expensive. But I don't know, that doesn't necessarily mean it makes it better. It's just different. Yeah, but Colin,
it's interesting because there are benefits either way. Kind of like what Colin was talking about earlier versus the well-worn path versus de novo, right? Like there are pluses and minuses going each way, and I think each investor, like I don't think there are all investors of the same mind. I think depending on what they're looking for in their portfolio, they're going to consider how this fits into what their thesis is and what they're looking for and their timelines and a number of other things that are on their side to consider. And it becomes a question for a company of, with the resources you can access and do have access to and what you're trying to accomplish, Are you building from a base up? Are you trying to hit a certain mark first and then expand from there? These are all like, you know, specific, important, you know, existential questions that I think companies like that will have to deal with, right? And I don't know if there's any right answer, but I think whatever they choose, they have to make sure they stay in the lane so that they don't cross any lines that they shouldn't be.
I think it also dictates what your market, who your market is. Are you going to be selling to the general population, or do you want to sell into the healthcare system and get this adopted by the health system? So it really dictates your market to your choice.
Right. Right. I think we chatted a bit before about, you know, how the indication for use also helps define, you know, is it a med device or a therapeutic, or is it, you know, a wellness device, or a, you know, maybe a adjuvant or something. But yeah, I've heard it come up before where, you know, a data gathered can help help a physician make a decision, in which case, you know, oh, we're clinical decision support. But then at what point would clinical decision support sort of become a class 2 medical device? Like we've seen this one happen a few times, and like clarifying that gray area is a bit tricky. But I guess from the investor point of view, does it matter if you maybe don't have that defined at the beginning? Or do you think that's very important to like be super clear on your path? Like what are the motivations there from an investment standpoint?
Well, I think I think you should have a clear indication of what you want to do, because it really does change how much money you're going to need in the company. It's going to change all kinds of things if you're picking one over the other. And from an investor point of view, what I'd be looking for is just a clear indication of what their planning is. But you can have a, you know, contingency plan. Maybe we're going to first just start, and our indication of use is going to be this. It's going to be a wellness. It's going to get us to our minimal viable product, and then we're going to do a study, and we're going to do all this other work that will then trigger us into a higher class. So it's not one or the other as much as I'd be looking for, you know, a team or an idea that has the story, or they've thought about it, or they have a plan. You know, things change, you know, environments change, but I'd be looking for the confidence that I'm investing in a group that understands the environment, understands that things can change, and I have confidence that they'll make the right decision when it comes to it.
Yeah. So it comes back to team. It comes back to have a plan and then have a good team. It sounds like. Which, I mean, I think that's pretty general when it comes to, you know, the investment sort of like framework. It's like, do you have the right people in place? Do you have the right team? I mean, we've talked about some of the you know, maybe flagged type areas, whether that's regulatory, whether that's, you know, deciding if you're in this space or this space. Do you have the pieces in place? Do you have a QMS? But yeah, I would say those might be specific to the health sector. There are questions that come up, but they're not, ultimately, the answers to those aren't any different than what you'd ask for a regular company that isn't in the health space. Do you have the right people? Have you made the plan? Some nuances of the plan are different, but yeah, fundamentals. So before we wrap things up here, did anybody want to add one more burning insight to one of these specific areas?
I have no burning insights into any specific areas. I think for early stage investors that aren't comfortable in health, it's not as scary as it sounds. As you said, it's the same fundamentals. I mean, and find a good team, find a good, you know, that they're addressing a good market and they have an interesting technology. And if you can put all that together, I think the payout is huge. And that's really why, from an investor point of view, they should be looking at healthcare. because the return on investment could be, like in the billions. So just always willing to talk to any investors that don't know, want to have a little more details, but let's not be scared. Let's invest more into early stage health companies here in Western Canada.
Thanks, Colin. All right. Well, I think we should wrap it up there. Thanks so much, all of you, for coming to have this, discussion. I think it'll be some good points to bring to our investors and hopefully to some of our newer companies as well. Nice. All right.
Thank you, Christine.
Thank you.
Thanks, Christine.
Thanks, guys.